In ancient Rome, the most common prayer for a bride was not for happiness, but for survival. The scent of incense and myrrh mingled with the perfume of roses scattered across the floor of a patrician house, Rome, 47 BC. A 19-year-old girl, Valeria Quintina, clenched her hands so tightly that her nails left crescent marks on her palms. In a few hours, she would be delivered to a man whom Roman law considered her absolute master, not for one night, but for the rest of her life. She wore the tunica recta she had woven with her own hands, her hair braided into 6 plaits according to ancient tradition, her waist bound by the Knot of Hercules that only her husband would be able to untie, a knot that symbolized not union, but ownership. Her mother had embraced her that morning with glistening eyes. Her words still echoed in Valeria's mind like an ominous warning. It will be over by dawn. You must endure. 30 years of marriage condensed into 2 sentences. No explanation, no details. Just the echo of an experience that every Roman woman knew, but of which none dared speak openly. The young bride looked at her reflection in a polished bronze mirror and wondered if the woman she would see the next day would still be herself, or if that night would erase forever the girl she had been. What was about to happen was ancient Rome's darkest secret. Poets sang of the joys of love. Historians documented public ceremonies in great detail. But over the reality of the wedding night fell a deliberate silence, almost impenetrable. Mothers wept when their daughters married, aunts spoke in code, and for 2,000 years no one has ever wanted to tell what truly happened when the door of the bridal chamber closed. Until today, 3 hours before sunset, Valeria withdrew into a private room with her aunt Cornelia, a 43-year-old widow who had never remarried. Cornelia closed the door and spoke with a frankness that no other woman would have dared use. Her voice was low but firm. Her eyes searched those of her niece, trying to convey a truth that could save her life. According to Roman law, she explained, a wife's body belonged to her husband from the moment she crossed the threshold of his house. Cornelia sat down beside Valeria and took her hands. Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you could make the difference between a bearable life and a daily hell. The aunt had seen too much. She had witnessed marriages that transformed into prisons. She had consoled destroyed women. She had learned that knowledge was the only weapon available to a Roman bride. Physical resistance was useless and could provoke greater violence or divorce that would leave the woman without any protection whatsoever. Valeria's betrothed, Gaius Servilius Capito, was a 41-year-old widower whose first wife had died after 4 years of failed attempts to give him an heir. Valeria had met him only 3 weeks before, during the betrothal ceremony. She knew nothing of his character, his private habits, how he treated women when no one was watching. The social masks that Roman men wore in public completely concealed their domestic behavior. Put yourself in her shoes for a moment. You're 19 years old. You're about to be delivered to a stranger, and there's no one who can tell you what truly awaits you. This uncertainty was perhaps the most terrifying part. Cornelia continued her instruction with almost clinical precision. The experience of the first night depended entirely on the husband's character. Some men showed consideration, others treated their wife as a purchased right, indifferent to the fear or pain they caused. It was unlikely that a young bride could predict which of the 2 types had fallen to her lot. Survival, therefore, depended on the ability to adapt, to create small spaces of autonomy within a condition of total powerlessness. Roman marriage was not a union between equals, but a legal transfer of property from father to husband. The Patria potestas, the father's absolute authority over his children, included complete control over his daughter's body. With marriage, this control passed to the husband without interruption. The wedding ceremony did not celebrate love, but formalized this transfer of property. Consent within marriage was a concept that did not exist in Roman law. It seemed that no one cared what the bride felt. Consequently, the wedding night marked the moment when the husband took possession of his wife, the beginning of a submission that would last a lifetime. We must pause for a moment to understand the context. 1st century BC Rome was a society torn apart by civil wars, governed by ancient laws that considered women eternally minors. Girls were given in marriage as soon as they reached puberty. Often to much older men, chosen by families for political or economic reasons. In this world, the idea that a woman could have a say in her own marital destiny was simply unthinkable. This reality casts a completely new light on Valeria's fears. When the sun began to set on the horizon, Valeria returned to the main hall where guests were gathering for the wedding procession. She wore the flame-colored veil that covered her face, the flammeum that symbolized her new condition. The guests sang traditional songs, many of which contained crude allusions to the imminent night. It was a public celebration of what would happen in private, a collective acknowledgement of the inevitable. Valeria walked through the crowd with a serene smile painted on her face, while inside her every step seemed to bring her closer to a precipice. If these buried truths disturb you as much as they have disturbed me, subscribe to Vox History, because what Valeria was about to discover beyond that threshold would surpass her worst fears. The procession wound through the streets of Rome by torchlight. Musicians played flutes and drums. Children threw nuts as a symbol of fertility. Guests shouted "Talasio," according to ancient custom, but beneath the festive surface the procession recalled a darker memory, the rape of the Sabine women, when the first Romans had kidnapped the women of neighboring peoples to make them their wives. Every wedding procession was a ritual echo of that ancient violence. When they reached the house of Gaius Servilius, Valeria was lifted and carried across the threshold. This gesture, which today is considered romantic, had a very different meaning in ancient Rome. The bride did not enter her new home of her own will. She was physically transported to symbolize that she had no choice. Her feet were not to touch the threshold so as not to bring bad luck. But the real reason was deeper. The threshold marked the boundary between her previous life and her new existence. Inside the house, Valeria was led through a series of rituals. She received fire and water, symbols of her domestic duties. She offered prayers to the gods of her husband's house. She met the slaves she would have to manage. From that moment, her very name changed. She became simply Gaia, losing her individual identity to assume the generic one of Roman wife. Everything she had been up to that moment was erased to make room for her new role. The pronuba, the matron of honor, accompanied Valeria to the bridal chamber for final preparations. She was a woman in her 50s who had had a marriage considered fortunate, an indispensable requirement for holding that role. While she arranged the bride's veil, Valeria dared to ask her about her first night. The woman remained silent for a long moment, then replied in a flat voice, "There are things better forgotten. Memory can be the enemy of survival." She added nothing more. She lit the oil lamps, arranged the incense, and left Valeria alone in the perfumed half-light. The chamber had been prepared with meticulous care. The lectus genialis, the nuptial bed, was covered in fine fabrics and scattered with rose petals. The walls were decorated with frescoes showing mythological scenes. Candles and lamps created an atmosphere that should have been romantic, but which to Valeria seemed only disturbing. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited, listening to the sounds of the feast continuing in the other rooms. Every laugh, every toast, every song reminded her that the world was going on, while she awaited the moment that would define the rest of her existence. Gaius Servilius entered the chamber wearing a simple tunic. He carried a cup of wine that he set on the table without drinking it. His eyes examined Valeria from head to toe with the attention of one evaluating a purchase. He asked her questions about her health, about the constitution of the women in her family, about their ability to generate male children. These were not the questions of a lover, but of an owner verifying the quality of his new property. Valeria answered in a steady voice, hiding the terror that gripped her throat. When the interrogation was concluded, Gaius Servilius approached the nuptial bed. His hands untied the knot of Hercules with expert gestures, revealing that this was not the first time he had performed that act. Valeria closed her eyes and concentrated on her breathing, remembering her aunt's words. Don't resist, don't cry, don't give any reason for worse reactions. What happened next belonged to the silence that every Roman bride learned to guard. The following hours were a suspended eternity. Valeria stared at a point on the ceiling where the light from a lamp created dancing shadows, seeking refuge in a remote corner of her mind. When her husband finally withdrew, He told her that the next day the housekeeper would begin instructing her on her domestic duties. Then he left without looking back, closing the door behind him. Valeria remained motionless for what seemed an infinite time. When she finally found the strength to move, she rose with difficulty and washed herself with the water from the basin prepared beside the bed. She was erasing the traces of that night from her skin, but she knew that the traces in her soul would be much more difficult to eliminate. She dressed in the married woman's clothes that had been prepared for her and waited for dawn, sitting by the window, watching the stars slowly fade in the brightening sky. The next morning, Valeria met Tertia, the housekeeper who had managed the house for years. She was a woman of about 50, with eyes that had seen too much and a mouth that had learned to be silent. However, in the following days, Tertia became a precious ally. She taught Valeria not only how to manage the house, but how to manage the master, what his moods were, when it was better to avoid him, how to anticipate his requests to minimize conflicts. In the following weeks, Valeria learned to navigate her new life like a ship in dangerous waters. She studied the rhythms of the house, her husband's preferences, the dynamics among the slaves. She also built silent alliances with the other women of the extended family, a network of mutual support that existed in the shadow of the patriarchal structure. Despite the imposed restrictions, every piece of information shared, every whispered advice, every small act of solidarity was an act of resistance against a system that wanted them isolated and powerless. There's a question that has tormented me since I began digging through these archives. How did millions of women find the strength to resist a system designed to annihilate them? Perhaps you have an answer that I cannot see. Write it in the comments, because every reflection adds a piece to this mosaic of forgotten stories. 3 months after the marriage, Valeria missed her monthly cycle. 2 months later, the pregnancy was confirmed. It was the most dangerous and most important moment of her life as a Roman woman. Maternal mortality was terrifying. About 1 woman in 50 died in childbirth, perhaps more for very young mothers. But pregnancy was also the only path toward a secure position in the family. A male child would transform Valeria from simple property to mother of the heir, a condition that brought respect and protection. The months of pregnancy were a period of relative truce. Her husband's nocturnal visits ceased to protect the fetus, and Valeria could finally concentrate on building her domestic power. It was necessary that she exploit that precious time. She deepened her knowledge of household management, forged stronger bonds with the other women, and began to prepare herself for the most dangerous moment of her existence. Each day that passed brought her closer both to possible death and to possible salvation. Labor began prematurely in the 7th month. It was an agony of 23 hours with complications that made them fear the worst. The midwife, a Greek woman named Is with 30 years of experience, worked tirelessly to save mother and child. At certain moments, Valeria was certain she would die. She saw shadows at the edges of her vision, felt her body giving way under the impossible strain. But in the end, against all expectation, a healthy baby was born, a male. Gaius Servilius entered the room when everything was finished. He looked at the son that Valeria held to her breast, with an expression she had never seen on his face. Respect, not love, not tenderness, but the recognition of her value as mother of his heir. From that moment, Valeria's position in the family changed substantially. She was no longer just property to be used, but the guardian of the bloodline, indispensable and therefore protected. In the following years, Valeria had 3 more children, definitively consolidating her status. As her husband aged, his nocturnal visits became increasingly rare until they ceased entirely. Valeria gradually assumed effective control of the house, managing the finances, directing the slaves, making decisions that would once have been the husband's exclusive prerogative. She had transformed her captivity into a form of power, limited but real. Her true legacy, however, was the network of support she built among the women of her community. She prepared young brides for what awaited them. She offered refuge and comfort to those who suffered violence. She transmitted the knowledge that could make the difference between surviving and succumbing. It was a silent work, invisible to the eyes of men, but vital for generations of women who came after her. Gaius Servilius died 22 years after their marriage. Valeria was 41 years old. For the first time in her adult life, she felt something resembling freedom. She chose not to remarry, preferring the autonomy of widowhood to the security of a new master. She dedicated her remaining years to helping other women, transforming suffering into a tool for collective survival. If this story is making you reflect on how much women have had to fight to conquer rights we take for granted today, leave a like. It's a small gesture, but it helps make these hidden truths known to those who have never heard them. The story of Valeria Quintina was not exceptional. It was therefore the norm. Millions of Roman women lived similar experiences, navigating a system that considered them property to be transferred between men. Their voices were systematically excluded from historical documents, their suffering hidden behind poetic descriptions of conjugal love. But the truth has remained buried in the interstices of history, in private letters, in veiled allusions, in eloquent silences. The legacy of this system persists even today in ways we often don't recognize. The legal doctrine according to which marital consent was irrevocable and a husband could not commit spousal abuse survived for centuries in Western legislation. In England, this law was abolished only in 1991, within the memory of those still living. Understanding this history is not an academic exercise, but a reminder of the vigilance necessary to protect hard-won rights. Valeria Quintina left no writings, erected no monuments, conquered no territories. But her silent resistance, her dedication to helping other women survive, represents a form of heroism that official history has always ignored. And perhaps this is the greatest secret. The true heroines of Rome were not those celebrated